Is the US on the brink of losing its status as the world's economic superpower? China is forecast to take over as a global leader by the end of this year. But what will that mean? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. The United States has been the global economic leader since overtaking the UK back in 1872. That was forecast to change, but not until 2019. But a new way of thinking is said to be revolutionizing the world's economic landscape. The World Bank's International Comparison Program has used what's called purchasing power parity to compare economies. PPP rests on the assumption that goods in different countries cost the same when the exchange rate is taken into account. Data calculated using this method suggests the US is likely to be overhauled by China far sooner than anticipated, perhaps even by the end of this year. The US remains the world's largest economy based on purchasing power parity. China was ranked a close second. Using PPP, India jumped above Japan, with Germany placed fifth. Russia, Brazil, France, the UK and Indonesia make up the top 10. And here's where the changes are happening. In the past, economic output was compared just by using exchange rates, which can be volatile and can and do fluctuate. Using this method, the previous World Bank report in 2005 showed China's economy at 43% of the size of the US. Latest figures using PPP and said to reflect the real cost of living put that figure at 87% in 2011. Now, the International Monetary Fund expects China's economy to have grown by 24% between 2011 and 2014. That's versus 7.5% for the US, leading to predictions that China will overtake the US sometime this year. We're going to try and make sense of all of this with the help of our panel. From Manila, Marshall Mays, director of the Asian Bond Market Forum and a former advisor to the People's Bank of China. On Skype from New York is Eswar Prasad, a senior professor of trade and policy at Cornell University and former head of the IMF's China division. And in our London studios is Fraser Howie, an Asian stock market specialist and co-author of Red Capitalism, the fragile financial foundation of China's extraordinary rise. Welcome to you all. Let's begin in London with Fraser Howie. First of all, how valid do you believe this new methodology is for calculating economic power?
I don't think it's that valid. I certainly think the leadership must be horrified to think that they're nearly the world's largest economic power. The man in the street in China certainly doesn't feel any richer today. And it's an interesting, what I would say, not necessarily an accounting trick, but it's an interesting, different way to look at things. And there is some merit to try and equate services at the real prices or what you get for your money across country by country. That said, PPP sort of ebbs and flows. Every few years, these sort of numbers come out, and obviously countries like India, countries like China, take on a much greater ranking because services and goods that are generally cheaper than they would be in the developed world. But I think it just goes to show how difficult measuring GDP is and actually getting a good handle in comparing different countries. I think very few people would think that India's economy is larger than Japan's, and you certainly would never get that feeling when you arrive in Tokyo versus when you arrive in Delhi. I think what we do know, though, is the Chinese economy continues to grow. It will ultimately overtake the US. It does have 4 to 5 times the population of the US. So China will become the world's largest economy. But just simply being the largest economy actually masks a lot of the problems that China does face going forward.
Well, Eswar Prasad, your view, first of all, on the validity of the methodology itself.
What it really tells us is what the standard of living is in China compared to the US, because what PPP does, which is quite important, is to take into account the fact that not all goods are traded. And if you think, for instance, about the price of a haircut in China, it's much lower than that in the US. So for the same amount of money, you can get many more haircuts in China. But the reality is that if you think about economic power, what really matters is what you can purchase with the amount of money that you have. not just in China, but in the rest of the world. So if you think about it from that perspective, market exchange rates make a lot more sense if you want to compare the size of economies with each other. But this is an important comparison in the sense that it suggests that the Chinese economy, in terms of the ability of Chinese citizens to afford goods and services, is certainly higher than we thought it was. But we should still remember that even if you take these calculations at face value, there is a gulf in purchasing power between the average Chinese citizen and the average US citizen. Because after all, even if the gross domestic product by this measure is the same in both countries, China still has a population about 4 to 5 times larger than that of the US. So these economies might be matched if you take these numbers at face value, but there is still a gulf in terms of levels of development between the two countries.
Well, Marshall Mays, that issue about levels of development and the gap between the countries, how important is that and how much is missed in terms of that by using the PPP?
Well, the PPP basket concept is quite valid if you're looking at how much aid or donorships, donor concessions to make or how to support growth. In fact, the sponsors for the studies have been basically organizations dedicated to developing growth. And if you measure the consumption basket that matters in the country of measure, then you get a good indication of what the benefit has been this year versus 10 years ago. And the projection shows that China, well, if you read the PPP basket, doesn't need any aid because it's a fully developed economy. It's not a middle income economy anymore. Reality, as the other two panelists have suggested, is not exactly the case. The income pyramid is not necessarily as flat as you might have expected in the United States. It's quite steep, in fact. Even though you've got a large population and a million millionaires, still you have a large poor population who's just above the threshold. The fabulous aspect of China, though, is not revealed as much in the PPP data as in the magnitude of poverty relief. The fact that you've brought 400 or 500 million people out of abject poverty into a low middle class income level is staggering. The point is that the United States, for example, has a very high energy intensity in its consumption basket, which means that if China, with about 1/10 that same intensity, were to try to approximate the US, the world's ability to extract energy from the ground and make it really available for everyone would disappear. So in reality, not only does China need to modulate its growth in energy intensity and the way it changes its consumption basket, but the rest of us in the rich world will have to also bring down our energy intensity in order to share the same wealth. So in other words, it's not so much a game about the poor catching up with the rich. That inevitably happens in an open trading system where it's based on performance versus just subsidies. However, the point is that as we begin to get a higher consumption basket, we'll have to reduce our overall consumption of scarce resources.
So basically, Fraser Howie, I mean, you're winning on the swings and losing on the roundabouts in a way. I mean, one of the factors that emerged in this report is that according to PPP analysis, the global gap between rich and poor is narrowing. In other words, the world is becoming more equitable according to these figures. What is your opinion on that analysis emerging out of it?
It would certainly seem to run counter to a lot of the headlines you would read or the protests you would see around the world, where there is a feeling that there is a greater divergence of equality, or certainly of incomes between the top 1% and the rest, as it were, and the hollowing out of the middle classes. I think, as Marshall has alluded to there, that these numbers, there is certainly some validity in using those numbers, and they certainly should be a factor to how to try and compare economies, but they're not telling you the entire story. And that certainly for an economy like China, or even the States, you're looking at huge countries here with a very diverse population and very diverse geographical locations and businesses and economic activity. And it's very difficult to try and talk about the average Chinese or even the average American anymore. It has to be a far more nuanced discussion. And therefore, whether you're talking about aid towards China, it needs to be clearly a lot more targeted than simply looking at the average numbers or thinking of China as the world's largest economy. I think that doesn't really help you get a good handle on what's happening in China.
Well, Eswar Prasad, I mean, that word that we heard there, a factor, that PPP is an important factor in looking at economies, but it's far more nuanced than that, as Fraser Howie was saying. Do you agree with that?
Now, certainly, no matter how you look at it, based on market exchange rates or PPP, there is a lot of convergence in the world. India and China are catching up to the US, no matter how you measure it in terms of the overall size of the economy, or even in terms of per capita incomes, that is income per citizen in those economies. On the inequality point, I do want to make one important distinction here. It is true that China and India and other emerging markets are catching up to the US in terms of per capita income. So that dimension of inequality, in terms of inequality across countries, is certainly declining. But within each country, including in the US and China, inequality is actually going up. So there are these two dimensions, but the fact that you have this huge mass of people in countries like China and India that are now catching up to the income levels of the US, although there is still a big gap, that I think is driving the overall inequality dynamic in the world. But the point that Marshall made is really important, that countries like India and China in particular, have done a remarkable job in the last decade or two of lifting a very large number of people out of poverty. And that I think is something that's worth focusing on, which is really the good news out of all of this.
Well, Marshall Mays, yes, would you like to add to that? You brought up that point about how China has upped not only its economy, but also the average Chinese participation within that economy. That is something that has emerged from these figures, is it not?
Absolutely, and this is perhaps the most important fact overall, is that as any economy moves to the point where the middle class becomes a large part of the population, they begin to try to defend their property rights and their wealth they have, and they begin to require good government and rules and laws that work. That's actually the biggest force against corruption in any society. And while all societies have some level, the extent to which the middle class is big, they require constraints on the elite and provide benefits to the poor by setting up those laws. China is right now in the beginning of that process. While the intent of the regulators is to set up a good rule, a working legal system, and laws that are reasonable in their basis, setting that system up is basically damaging and threatening a lot of incumbents who have worked well in this system for the last 4 decades. This is the big challenge that the Communist Party in particular has, but any society in which you're moving from a poor to a middle to a higher income status must go through. And I think that political throw, which China is working on, is really the biggest challenge it has. How do you deal with a better level of wealth and a more demanding middle class? Maybe the system you expect to work does not work anymore. Once you get big, your percentage growth rate, just because you're so big, can't be as high. And your ability to distribute wealth to that voting middle class, the class that matters for the rulers, all of a sudden becomes very weak. And so in a sense, the richer you get, the more tenuous your power is in exerting it. You see it in many of the OECD economies, very poor control in a democratic system of any policy. The policy changes with the fashion by the population. China has had not that problem because it has had a fairly rigorous and straightforward policy from the top down. That is changing, and as China moves from the top down to a bottom-up public policy stance, it will go through great throes, and in fact, its real growth could actually slow down quite a bit in the next decade.
Well, Eswar Prasad, I want to pick up on one thing that Marshall has just been talking about there, the correlation between the growth of a middle class and democracy. This is an exceedingly important point, it would imply, insinuating that the middle class, a greater middle class, puts pressure on the leadership elites of any country, and particularly that of China. Would you concur?
That is a logical proposition, but I'm not entirely sure the logic is going to work well in the context of China. Because one thing that we seem to be seeing is that what the middle class in China really wants is economic stability and the performance from the government in terms of superior economic performance, and that the government has certainly been delivering. My own view about China is that the Chinese Communist Party largely derives its legitimacy and its ability to persist from the fact that it is able to deliver the economic goods to the people. Now, certainly, even in China's case, there are moves towards legal reforms. But what they mean by legal reforms are essentially the sort of reforms such as maintenance of property rights, contractual rule of law, and so on, that are necessary to make a market-oriented system work much better. But I don't sense in China a real wellspring of a desire for political freedoms of the sort that we might think would be logical for the middle class to demand. And I think the Chinese Communist Party certainly has made it very clear that it's very focused on financial market and economic reforms, but has swept the notion of other broad reforms to political, legal, and institutional structures off the table. But those pressures might rise over time, but I think those are pressures that the Chinese Communist Party isn't planning to give in to anytime soon.
Well, Fraser Howie, your view, is this more logical than real, the pressure that middle classes put to bear on their leadership?
Well, I'm not too sure. I dislike this phrase middle class that's often used about basically anyone who's come out of severe poverty somehow suddenly becomes the middle class. Some measures of middle class start as low as $2 a day, and I think that for many, certainly European or American listeners who think about the middle class, you're talking about people who've certainly got a far greater income than $2 a day. And I'm not even sure that middle class is merely just an economic measure. That term itself touches a whole host of other areas, sociological, political, aspirational as well, not merely an economic income. What I think certainly China does have a problem with, as both of the other panelists have talked about, is that it's very clear that the leadership in the past 18 months or so have come out very strongly trying to pursue a reform agenda. There's been a lot of talk and the need to bring greater reform to many areas of the economy. They have talked about the market being the decisive factor. And yet they still want to have the primacy of and there's ultimately absolute control of the Communist Party. I simply don't think those things sit well together, because it's not necessarily middle classes demanding democracy or the vote which is the problem. But if you're going to tackle corruption, if you're going to build real institutions, you need checks and balances. And that has to be a system of accountability where people know that they can complain about things, that they know that the judicial system will work free and fairly. And of course, you simply don't have that in China.
Marshall Mays, the whole issue of, regardless of the validity of the figures using PPP, but the issue that China may surpass the United States as the world's economic leader in inverted commas, this must have a political impact as well, does it not? A form of propaganda impact by that government that now claims to be the most powerful?
Well, certainly as the resource constraints begin to be felt, as the energy consumption goes up, most of the automobiles that drive in China drive on imported fuel now because everything else is local, but they can't bring the local fuel in. So as that goes to be a factor, the attachment of gaining control over resources is big. And as you know, that's one of the points of contention with the neighbors in the eastern China Sea and the South China Sea, is whether that oil on the ground is partly ours or all ours or most of yours. This is a negotiation which should be quite straightforward in the law of the sea, but in fact it's not being quite so straightforward. It's a game that's going on and has gone on in the past. But I think the fact that they're feeling constraints on this, particularly as the United States tries to make up its mind politically whether it's going to be focusing on oil in the Middle East or its friends that it trades heavily with in East Asia, trying to keep China from fighting with its neighbors, because if it does so, then the U.S. loses. Acting as referee is a game the United States has often tried to get into with an agenda of its own, which basically causes problems. But in this case, I think what it's trying to do is play as a fair referee. The problem is that's not welcome at the moment, and certainly the suddenly appearance of this data item, which is almost a year and a half old, in the news is a bit curious, because it's specifically the time when the U.S. president is making his last big trip to Asia to show this solidarity with friends around China. Oh, we're not trying to contain China, but we are trying to make fair discussions. There's a little bit of a soft propaganda war going on, I think, right now, and perhaps that is the source of this particular article. Even though the contents of it are, I think, materially correct, they missed the general point, which is there's a great power politics game going on. And this is one piece of ammunition. We are bigger than you are now, but in fact, that's not what PP says. PP says we are less well off, we are better off than we were compared to you, not that our economy is bigger than yours.
Well, Eswar Prasad, your view about this soft propaganda war that may or may not be going on, bearing in mind, as Marshall pointed out, the recent trip by Obama to the region, one that did not include China.
Let me make 2 points here. First of all, no matter how you cut it, the fact is that China is now a major economic power and one that is contributing much more to world growth than even the US. So even if you consider these two economies at market exchange rates, the US economy is about $16 trillion, the Chinese economy is about $8 trillion, but the Chinese economy is growing, if you account for inflation, at about 7 to 8% a year. The US economy is growing at 2 to 3%. So even in terms of contribution to world growth, the amount of resources that the economy is demanding, China is clearly a far more important player than the US at the margin in terms of growth rates. Now, the Chinese have in fact not been that enthusiastic about this report. They have in fact disowned part of these numbers, and they have stepped back. The National Bureau of Statistics of China has in fact argued that these numbers are imprecise. The reason they're doing that is if, in fact, China is the largest economy in the world, it comes not only with certain amount of prestige, but also with certain responsibilities. It would mean, as was discussed earlier, that China not only should not be receiving any aid, but it should, in fact, be aiding other poorer countries. It means that China needs to play a more constructive role when it comes to issues like climate change, when it comes to issues of international governance. So they recognize that it's a mixed blessing, and they don't necessarily want to be seen as the numero uno in the world, because that confers a lot of responsibilities on them that they don't really want right now. In fact, they've been arguing for a long time that they are still a developing country. They still have development needs. And in fact, countries like the US that are much more advanced in terms of their income levels and levels of development should pay a much bigger price when it comes to things like climate change and should lead the agenda rather than poorer developing countries like China.
Well, Fraser Howie, your view about that, the mixed blessing of being cast as the world's economic leader?
Yeah, no, it's very much a mixed blessing. I said earlier that the leadership must be horrified that this news is out there. I wouldn't necessarily use the word responsibility as Eswar used. I would actually use the word expectations, that if you're the world's largest economy, and we know there's issues with the PPP number, etc. But if you're such a big economy, then people do expect you to be taking a lead. They're looking for you to be constructive in dialogue. They're looking for you to be an agent of change. They're not looking. A leader needs to lead and have somewhere to go, and not simply be at the front of the queue, as it were. And China has been completely unwilling to take the lead. They're very good at telling the world what they don't like. They don't like what's going on in Syria. They don't like what's going on in Ukraine. They don't like what's going on in many places, but they don't enunciate very clearly or at all what they actually want to do. They may not like how the World Bank is set up or the IMF is set up, but again, they're not very good on concrete proposals of actually showing what a new multipolar world would look like. They're very good at carving about America's role, but not clear about their own role, I think. And that partly comes down to a lack of confidence by the leadership in Beijing. They themselves are not comfortable operating on a global field. They have very few allies and very few friends, if any, outside of North Korea globally. There are many people who want to do business with the Chinese, but it would be very hard to look at any major power who says that they are a friend of China and could defend and support China's actions. So these types of headlines must certainly horrify the leadership, and certainly the leadership in Beijing have been very good at playing at both ends of talking about the growing might of China and the benefits that dealing with China can bring, and yet at the same time say, oh, but don't forget we're actually still a very poor country. We have many tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people who are still under $2 a day or so, and they're absolutely right. And this is highlights some of the challenges that face China. But these types of China is number one headlines are very much a mixed blessing.
Well, Marshall Mays, is there perhaps an element to all of this, a report such as what we're discussing now, that also moves the center of political power, global political power, away from the West, away from the United States, and attempts intentionally to posit it somewhere else, to say that there is a change globally where power is becoming decentralized? Is there a political impetus behind reports such as this?
Oh yes, that's certainly true. I think it's been quite obvious for more than a decade that the economic locus of power, and therefore the political power that follows economics, is moving across the Pacific from North America and Europe to Asia in general. It wasn't just Japan, the large economy, then the great tigers. Now you have the big mass of China, and following behind it at in India at a Hindu rate of growth, the Indian economy. That will eventually be the great challenge to China. In fact, as India begins to catch up with more accountability politically to its masses, to better regulations at work, it's not so much the US and China, that's the current discussion, but in fact the long-term growth figure is those who share borders with the Himalayan mountains, who are not exactly the best of neighbors. I think the point we should focus on here as a closing matter is the question you raised earlier of accountability. Problems that China's had in being seen as the leader in any size of the world is it has the accountability it doesn't want to take on its shoulders, which means it has to confer either security benefits to its neighbors or material benefits. It's been doing some material benefit transfers to Africa and other resource markets, but not anywhere else. And so it doesn't want to take on those burdens too fast because it still has the accountability of much of the western part of its own country.
Well, a changing world indeed. At that point, my thanks to our guests, Marshall Mays, Eswar Prasad, and Fraser Howie. And do please share any thoughts that you might have with us. You can join the discussion at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And on Twitter, send your comments to @AJ Inside Story. I'm Mike Hanna. Thanks for watching, and goodbye for now.